Most people believe their actions come from decisions, that if they slow down, think carefully, and try harder, their life will change. But notice how often that isn't true. You promise yourself you won't check your phone, and your hand reaches for it anyway. You decide to speak honestly, and the words die before they reach your mouth. You tell yourself you're fine while something tightens quietly in your chest. These moments don't feel dramatic, they feel automatic, as if something else moved first and your mind followed after to explain it. We like to believe we are steering our lives through conscious choice. But much of what we do happens before thought arrives, before reasoning, before intention, not because you lack discipline, not because you're unaware, but because a deeper system is already in motion. There is a layer of the mind that doesn't argue with you. It doesn't persuade, it doesn't announce itself. It simply acts. It decides what feels safe, what feels familiar, what feels worth avoiding, and it does this quietly, efficiently, without asking for permission. You can feel it when you repeat patterns you swore you were done with, when you react faster than you can explain, when your life feels strangely consistent, even when you're trying to change it. This isn't a flaw, it's a mechanism, a system built to keep you alive long before it was designed to make you fulfilled. And the strange part is this: the more you try to control it with force, the louder it becomes. The more you judge it, the less it cooperates, because this system doesn't respond to pressure, it responds to conditions. Once you understand how it works, not as a mystery, not as magic, but as a biological and behavioral process, something shifts, not motivation, not effort, clarity. And clarity changes what effort never could. Attention is often treated as a character trait, something you either possess or lack, but biologically it functions more like a limited supply of energy that gets allocated moment by moment. Your brain is constantly deciding where to send this resource long before conscious intention enters the picture. Every sound, notification, movement, or thought competes for that allocation, and once attention is spent, it cannot be instantly replenished through willpower. This is why focus fades even when motivation remains strong. The system governing attention evolved to prioritize survival, not productivity or personal goals. It is tuned to novelty, change, and potential threat because for most of human history, noticing what changed in the environment mattered more than sustaining concentration on one abstract task. In modern life, this ancient prioritization collides with environments designed to trigger constant shifts in attention. Screens refresh endlessly, social information updates in real time, and unresolved tasks linger in the background of awareness. Each of these pulls attention away in small increments, creating a slow drain rather than an obvious collapse. What feels like distraction is often just resource depletion. When attention is low, the brain defaults to whatever requires the least energy, which is usually familiar behavior rather than deliberate choice. This explains why habits persist even when you intellectually understand they are unhelpful. The brain is conserving energy, not sabotaging you. Trying to force attention through effort alone often backfires because effort itself consumes the same limited resource you are trying to preserve. Thinking harder does not create more attention, it spends more of it. This is why long periods of mental strain can leave you feeling foggy rather than accomplished. The system was never meant to run at full intensity without recovery. Attention recovers not through motivation, but through reduction of input, predictability, and rest. When stimulation drops, the brain no longer needs to scan constantly, allowing attention to stabilize naturally. Understanding attention as a biological resource removes moral judgment from focused problems and replaces it with a clearer question: what conditions are quietly draining this resource faster than it can recover? And how often is your environment demanding vigilance when nothing truly requires it? The human brain is designed to reduce effort wherever possible, and one of the main ways it does this is by turning repeated patterns into automatic responses. This process is efficient and necessary. If every action required conscious decision making, even basic daily life would be exhausting. Over time, the brain learns which stimuli usually lead to something useful, interesting, or relieving, and it begins to respond to them before conscious thought has a chance to intervene. Distraction often emerges from this same efficiency system. When a certain cue repeatedly leads to stimulation, relief, or novelty, the brain wires a fast pathway toward it. That pathway does not ask whether the behavior aligns with long-term goals. It only asks whether the pattern has worked before. In modern environments, This automation system is constantly being trained in ways that favor fragmentation. Notifications, feeds, messages, and alerts all function as cues that promise information or social relevance. Even when the content itself is meaningless, the anticipation alone is enough for the brain to initiate the behavior automatically. Over time, attention shifts become reflexive rather than chosen. You may reach for a phone, switch tabs, or check messages without experiencing a clear decision point. This is not a lack of discipline, it is learned automation operating below awareness. The brain is doing what it has been trained to do repeatedly. What makes this especially powerful is that automation bypasses fatigue signals. Because the behavior feels small and familiar, the brain does not register it as effort, even though each shift fragments attention further. The more often attention is broken, the harder it becomes to sustain depth, which then increases reliance on automated behaviors because deep focus now feels costly. This creates a feedback loop where distraction trains more distraction. Importantly, automation does not distinguish between helpful and unhelpful patterns. It only encodes frequency and outcome. If stress is frequently followed by scrolling, the brain links stress to scrolling. If boredom is followed by checking updates, boredom becomes a trigger. These links form regardless of intention. Trying to override them with force usually fails because automation operates faster than conscious control. The mind notices the action after it has already begun. Change, therefore, does not come from constant self monitoring, but from altering the conditions that train these automatic responses in the first place. When cues are reduced, delayed, or made less predictable, the automation system weakens. When environments are stable and low in interruption, the brain no longer needs to default to rapid switching, and attention gradually regains continuity without requiring constant effort. When attention feels unstable, the instinctive response is often to push harder mentally. People try to concentrate by applying more effort, more internal pressure, more self talk. The assumption is that focus works like a muscle that simply needs to be flexed with greater intensity. But the mind does not operate that way. Thinking harder often increases mental noise rather than clarity because effort amplifies whatever is already present in the cognitive system. If the mind is already crowded with unfinished tasks, alerts, expectations, and background concerns, adding force does not organize those elements. It agitates them. This is why intense effort can feel mentally loud, restless, and tense rather than precise. The brain's attentional system is sensitive to load, not intention. When you apply force without reducing input, you increase internal competition. More thoughts surface, not fewer. More impulses demand relevance. The mind begins cycling through possibilities, worries, and associations, mistaking activity for control. This is not a failure of intelligence, it is a predictable response to overload. Cognitive resources are limited, and when they are stretched thin, the system prioritizes scanning over depth. It becomes vigilant rather than focused. That vigilance feels like effort, but it produces fragmentation. In modern environments, this pattern is reinforced constantly. People move from interruption to interruption, then attempt to compensate by forcing concentration during moments that are already depleted. The result is mental strain without sustained progress. The brain interprets strain as urgency, which further narrows working memory and increases sensitivity to distraction. This creates a paradox where trying harder makes the task feel heavier and the mind more scattered. Another reason effort backfires is that conscious control operates slower than automatic processes. When you attempt to micromanage attention through constant self instruction, you introduce delay and friction. The mind starts monitoring itself instead of engaging with the task. This self monitoring consumes the same resources required for comprehension and reasoning. Instead of thinking, you are thinking about thinking. Over time, this produces fatigue and frustration, reinforcing the belief that focus is fragile or unreliable. In reality, the problem is not insufficient effort, but excessive cognitive interference. Clarity emerges when unnecessary signals are reduced, not when effort is increased. This is why focus often returns unexpectedly during calm, uninterrupted moments, such as walking alone, working in silence, or engaging deeply with something absorbing. In those states, the brain is not being forced. It is being information arrives at a manageable rate. So the attentional system can stabilize naturally. The mistake is believing that control must feel intense. Effective attention often feels quiet. It does not announce itself with tension. It feels like absorption rather than pressure. When people stop trying to overpower distraction and instead remove the conditions that generate it, Focus reappears without struggle. The mind prefers coherence over force, and when given fewer competing signals, it organizes itself with surprising reliability. Living on autopilot is not the absence of activity, but the absence of presence. It happens when behavior continues without conscious engagement, guided more by habit, expectation, and emotional conditioning than by choice. On the surface, life may appear functional, even successful. Routines are maintained, responsibilities are met, goals are pursued. Yet internally, something feels dull, repetitive, or strangely hollow. This emptiness is not caused by laziness or lack of ambition, but by prolonged disconnection between conscious awareness and the subconscious signals that give experience its meaning. When actions are repeated without reflection, the nervous system remains locked in survival efficiency rather than emotional aliveness. The brain prioritizes speed and predictability over depth, reducing experiences to tasks rather than moments. Over time, this creates a sense that days blur together, that time passes without being felt, that achievements land without satisfaction. Psychologically, autopilot is a protective adaptation. It develops when awareness once felt unsafe or overwhelming. By narrowing attention and relying on routine, the mind minimizes emotional risk. This can be useful in short periods of stress, but damaging when it becomes a lifestyle. The subconscious continues sending signals through fatigue, restlessness, anxiety, or vague dissatisfaction, but the conscious mind stays busy enough to ignore them. The result is internal misalignment. You keep moving, but you are no longer steering. Neuroscience shows that when attention is chronically divided or disengaged, the brain's default mode network becomes overactive. This network is associated with rumination, self referential thought, and emotional looping. Even while performing tasks, the mind drifts into unresolved narratives, replaying old concerns or imagined futures. This is why autopilot living often feels mentally exhausting despite minimal emotional engagement. The brain is active, but not integrated. Emotion, sensation, and intention are no longer synchronized. Relationships suffer under this pattern as well. Conversations become transactional, listening becomes partial, and connection is replaced by performance. People respond based on scripts learned long ago rather than genuine feeling in the moment. Love becomes routine, work becomes obligation, rest becomes guilt ridden. Because the subconscious is not being acknowledged, it begins expressing itself indirectly through burnout, loss of motivation, or sudden emotional collapse. These are not failures, but signals. The psyche attempting to restore balance by interrupting mechanical functioning. Autopilot also distorts identity. When choices are made automatically, people begin to define themselves by what they do rather than what they feel or value. Life becomes something that happens to them rather than something they inhabit. Breaking this cycle does not require drastic change, but restored awareness. Small moments of attention reconnect the conscious mind to the deeper currents guiding behavior. Without that connection, life continues efficiently, but meaning remains out of reach. Awareness is the turning point where the subconscious stops ruling from the shadows and begins to work with you instead of against you. Most people believe insight alone is enough, that once something is understood intellectually, it will change. But the subconscious does not respond to logic. It responds to attention, safety, and repetition. This is why real change feels slow, emotional, and sometimes uncomfortable. When you begin to observe your inner world without immediately fixing, suppressing, or judging it, the nervous system receives a new signal it is safe to feel. That safety is what allows buried material to surface. Thoughts you avoided, emotions you numbed, memories you rushed past begin to appear not to punish you, but to be integrated. The subconscious has been carrying them alone, repeating patterns because repetition was the only language it had. Awareness gives it a new one. From a neurological perspective, sustained attention changes brain wiring. When you notice a reaction instead of automatically acting on it, the prefrontal cortex becomes active, interrupting old emotional loops. This pause weakens habitual pathways and slowly strengthens new ones. Over time, what once felt automatic becomes optional. This is not self control through force, but self regulation through understanding. The body no longer has to scream through anxiety or exhaustion to be heard. It begins to trust that signals will be noticed. As this trust builds, emotional intensity softens, not because feelings disappear, but because they are no longer trapped. Psychologically, this integration feels like coming home to yourself. You start recognizing when a response belongs to the present and when it belongs to the past. A criticism no longer feels like a childhood threat. Silence no longer feels like abandonment. Desire no longer feels dangerous. This doesn't make life painless, but it makes pain informative rather than overwhelming. The subconscious becomes less reactive and more intuitive. Decisions feel grounded instead of compulsive. You begin acting from alignment rather than fear. Most importantly, awareness restores authorship. Life stops feeling like something that happens to you and starts feeling like something you participate in. You are no longer dragged by invisible currents. You feel them, understand them, and move with them consciously. The subconscious does not disappear in this process. It becomes a collaborator, offering instinct, creativity, and emotional depth without hijacking behavior. This is not the elimination of darkness, but the end of division. If there is one truth to carry forward, it is this: nothing inside you is random. Your habits, fears, longings, and contradictions are not flaws in your character, but messages from a deeper intelligence that learned how to keep you alive before you ever learned how to explain yourself. The subconscious was never your enemy. It was your protector when you had no other choice. But protection is not the same as freedom. The moment you begin listening instead of resisting, everything changes. You stop fighting yourself. You stop mistaking survival for identity. You stop calling repetition destiny. Awareness does not give you control over life, but it gives you honesty. And honesty is where transformation begins. Not loud, not dramatic, quiet, steady, and irreversible. You don't wake up by escaping your depths. You wake up by entering them, by noticing what moves you before thought, what reacts before reason, what aches beneath success and silence. When you do, life no longer feels mechanical or empty. It feels inhabited. And maybe that is the real awakening, not becoming someone new, but finally meeting the one who has been guiding you all along.